Hello and welcome to the Peace Talk. The world seems out of control. The violation of international law appears to have become the new normal. From armed conflicts to genocide and to geopolitical shifts, the rules that were meant to protect peace and stability are increasingly ignored. In this interview, I want to explore what the erosion of norms really means. And I want to elaborate on the question if international law still has the capacity to restrain power in times of the poly crisis. This and many questions more we'll discuss with Professor Teivo Teivainen. Teivo is a professor of world politics at the University of Finland, previously head of the political science department and research director of the Center for Excellence on the department on global governance. In 2022, he was appointed also by the Finnish government as the chair of National Commission for UNESCO. And now he is at the Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies. Dear Professor Teivo, it's a great honor and a great pleasure to have you on this program.
It's an honor and pleasure to be here and chat a little bit with you about these fascinating and complicated topics.
So, after 2 attempts, we are finally live. I'm glad, and now I want to ask you a tough question, but an important one. Teivo, how would you diagnose the current, if we want to call it, illness or lack, or how I'm even not sure how to express it. Let's call it illness of the rules-based international order. Is it, in your opinion, a temporary condition that will pass? Is it a cyclical crisis that comes and goes, like the First World War, then the Second World War? Or, is it a long-term transformation into something else? Maybe into a multipolar world order, maybe into a new Cold War, as Adam Tooze stated it? Or is it something new, an authoritarian shift? So I let you think about this question.
All right, thank you. I'm quite skeptical of kind of medical metaphors when analyzing social phenomena, though I probably often use them myself also. So I come from a background where something like world systems analysis was very important, and of course, in that framework, it's possible to think that historical systems like this current world system have a kind of lifespan and in this case starting roughly 500 years ago, and many within that framework have been talking about the demise of the current capitalist world system, which is also a world economy, in some point in the coming decades. So I'm not sure. The future is very complicated. I do believe it's probably not merely cyclical in the sense of, every couple of decades things change, or a few decades. There's something more important, more long-term happening that has to do with expansion of global capitalism, commodification of things, and then there not being that much room for further expansion, and that causing all kinds of things. At the same time, I don't want to, and I don't consider myself as deterministic as some friends in what was traditionally perhaps the world system school and all that. So the future is in many ways open. But so to give a short answer, I don't think it's just a temporary thing. I don't think it's cyclical in the sense that we would go back to some previous moment in the evolution of the world system. I think history has an arrow of time, so technically speaking, we couldn't go back. Yes, so I think it's fair to say that the there have been since, let's say, the Second World War, all kinds of changes in power of different kinds of actors, in the way capitalist world economy has evolved, that the current institutional structure is in deeper trouble than just a minor temporary or even cyclical crisis. But we cannot be totally sure about it. It's also possible that, for example, the possibilities to expand for capitalist accumulation, maybe there are new ways of money making and commodification, accumulation in sort of beyond what we traditionally consider the physical realm of production and all that, and how artificial intelligence will change this thing, whether there will be some elements of further stabilization to the system, or, as seems more likely, further erosion of sort of stabilities that we've still been experiencing despite recent turbulence in world politics.
Absolutely. So, with through the lens of the regulation theory, for example, Aglietta and many more, even Bob Jessup, the capitalist system finds always new ways of regulation, to regulate this inherent contradiction. For example, the contradiction between work and capital that Marx stated many years ago, but also this very obvious contradiction between endless accumulation, endless drive for more and more and more, economic growth and so on and so forth. And at the same time, we are in a planet that has, limited resources. So this has to come to a limit. And a political science professor here in Austria, in Vienna, he wrote a book recently on the limit of capitalism. And that's why he stated, using Rosa Luxemburg's also concepts, that, there is not much room any longer. So a conflict has to arise automatically. So I'm wondering if you agree with that kind of analysis.
I think it makes sense to analyze, on the one hand, room in the sense that you described, like whether unlimited expansion in a limited space, or something that has to do with political economy analysis of sort of logical limits to some kind of expansion, whether it's of accumulation or something. And then the other kinds of limits that are presented by climate change, most importantly in recent times. And I think it's good in debates to somehow analytically sometimes distinguish between the two. And now we've been talking a little bit more of sort of classical social science kind of limits in the models of different political economists and other social scientists. But of course, the melting of the glaciers and these things that are changing our physical environment are, of course, presenting another very concrete limit to our future and future scenarios. So it's quite likely that even if the Rosa Luxemburgs and Immanuel Wallersteins and whoever they were may not have been 100% correct about the limits of the capitalist system for its expansion, I think the nature is presenting other kinds of limits that also open perhaps eyes of people coming from different backgrounds, different theoretical frameworks, to think that we can't just go on, business as usual. So the question of the future is huge, and it's much more present than just sort of Marxist-oriented or critical political economy-oriented theories as it used to be.
Absolutely, I agree. And paradoxically, the glaciers that are not there any longer in the Arctic and so on and so forth. So this brings new opportunities, geopolitically speaking, for big powers to compete. For example, Russia and NATO in the Arctic region for discovering new resources. I was, stunned that I believe Putin in a what is it called? This, I have to look it up. Anyways, this. And he put a, maybe not he, but the Russian Federation put a Russian flag on the ground of the sea in the Arctic region. So and China stated, I believe, that it's an Arctic near state. So we see many places where this new kind of climate crisis, but also melting of the glaciers, have produced new, maybe let's call it opportunities, but also new geopolitical rivalries in the in that sense. So yeah.
Yes, I think it's obvious, and for the Chinese in particular, within what is sometimes called Belt and Road Initiative or the New Silk Road, what we in Finland at least call the Northeastern Passage, the possibility to travel from China across the northern seas, north of Russian landmass, is getting easier and easier. And that means many things for trade routes, for military competition. Melting ice means more possibilities for extraction of natural resources from different parts. And right now, as we talk, we are seeing some of this tension highlighted in the way Greenland is debated and the way Donald Trump is making pretty grandiose claims on Greenland and causing all kinds of tensions within NATO and within this atmosphere. So, and one thing about the Arctic, now that the Arctic is becoming more important than before, I'm not a big scholar on the Arctic, so I don't claim much expertise there, but it's clear it's always been seen as a sort of territory really without people, without inhabitants, like something to conquer. I've been going a little bit to meetings like in the last months to Faroe Islands or Iceland and in the north and those seas, and that's a complaint many people there have been making, like the imaginaries of the Arctic are always like a place without the people, and there's nothing really new about the Arctic being seen as a space where great powers or explorers go and imagine it as something without the people with resources to conquer. And there you have the Arctic Council has recently been a little bit maybe downplayed in its importance, but China has been entering in these sort of Arctic frameworks of cooperation and discussion about the future. In Finland also now is in the last few years, people here have been thinking about the Arctic much more seriously, much more strategically than before.
And now we talked about capitalism, which is a system that works internationally, that transcends borders. We spoke also about climate change, which has the same features, which transcends international borders. So let's talk about the Westphalian system, the classical nation state and the state system that we had so far after, at least for 100 or 200 years. Maybe it seems ill-equipped to handle this transnational crisis as capitalist production, exploitation, but also climate crisis, and also pandemic. The COVID crisis showed us that we are independent, and so we have to tackle these things on a more international level. And maybe also you were head of the department on the topic of global governance. So maybe coming from this lens, maybe a system of global governance, a multilateral system like the UN, maybe, if we achieve to transform it and reform it, is the best solution for our problems. Would you agree on that?
Probably yes. Of course, one thing is, I mean, on the principle, but there are certain issues where global coordination and something we could call global governance is probably needed. And whether that comes through multilateralism of the traditional kind within the interstate system with different frameworks for states collaborating and making decisions, whether one country, one vote, or some other system of decision making globally. This is basically the UN framework. So perhaps there's no principled reason why that could not be a kind of reasonably useful framework for finding these solutions. Of course, the UN is in many ways has many problems that we can talk about more. Then there's this thing that political actors in the global system are not only the states, and now perhaps this is more obvious than before. Of course, in some frameworks, again, like in World Systems Framework or some other frameworks, it's been perhaps more obvious before that the Westphalian system was never as state-centric as we imagined it. And transnational corporate powers, economic institutions were always relatively important and were also sources of power that we could call political power. And then there's this thing about social movements and non-governmental organizations, and something where initiatives like the World Social Forum and others have been emerging in recent decades about how to think about civil society or social movements, social actors as political actors also in the world economy. So one of the big questions then is to what extent we will have and whether we will see frameworks where non-state actors, whether they are corporations or social movements, will also somehow be taken into account as political actors. And I think it's more obvious in the case of big corporations that their what I would call state-likeness is becoming slightly more obvious. And I've been in some of my recent studies, I've been looking at it through the lens of representation. We often tend to think that, okay, representation, only states do representation. They are representative. Maybe they have a parliament, they elect a president, whatever, if we assume a sort of standard liberal democratic kind of thing. And so they are representative, whereas supposedly big corporations are not representative. But actually, if you look at big corporations, they are representative. They're just not democratically representative, but often those we would call public corporations that have shares sold publicly. You have shareholders who elect, and it's an election, who elect a board to represent them, and then the board, a little bit like the parliament, delegates powers to executive bodies. So I think in our language also we lack capacity to understand the political nature of the big corporations. We often tend to think that the big corporations impact the world only to the extent they impact the states or are impacted by the states, and that's how they become political. And in my work, I've been trying to look at how big corporations are political actors of their own right, because they're representative, they plan things, and there are many other things here that I count as their increasing state-likeness. So one big question is how to take into account these entities in the future of global governance, and there are many different answers to that question.
Absolutely, a good point that you mentioned now on the topic of representation. For example, there are more, how can I say, anarchist perspectives, individualist perspectives that are saying, okay, no one can represent my interests better than I, myself. So, and from that perspective on, representation becomes a very complicated question. There are some federalists who, or the principle of what is it called? Subsidiation? What is it called? That
Subsidiarity, I
yeah,
think.
yeah, yeah,
Like used
absolutely.
in the European Union, but also in other
Absolutely.
places. Yeah.
So you go from the smallest and go up and up and up. So there we have some kind of representation, and it's a quite fascinating topic. I mean, but
Of course, it's social.
where do you start and where do you begin with the question who can represent the other, and what entity is more important than the other, and that's a tough question.
Yeah, I once did a paper. It was published in Capital and Class on. It was called "Occupy Representation," and it was a little bit on that, like this anarchist in the social theory sense, not in the IR vague kind of anarchy in the international system kind of sense, but political anarchism. Exactly as you say, only I represent myself, and I was looking at the dead end streets that kind of position leads into, because if I take it from there, just to give an example, let's say Occupy Wall Street or all sorts of forums or something where people gather to make some kind of deliberation. And there's been a huge debate about how the entities of civil society and social movements can coherently make decisions. But then if you have this thing like, okay, only those present can represent themselves, only I can represent myself. It sounds kind of cool and radical and anarchist and with a lot of street cred. When you start looking at it, it has a class bias, because then it means, like, whether it's within a city, a occupied square, or whether it's a global coordination of social movements, then those who have the money to get a ticket to come there, to pay for their fare, to sort of transgress barriers of space and time and find free time and whatnot, or even come there through internet and have the machinery and software to do that. It's a privileged thing, and it's also in some sense a class thing. So if you believe that only I can represent myself, that kind of takes away the possibility of the poor people to decide and delegate someone to represent them in a meeting. And if you don't allow for that, as some anarchist interpretations claim, then you are actually closing the possibility for many people to participate in decision making in a way that implies a class bias. So I myself, I'm quite inspired by, let's say, left libertarian, socialist libertarian theories and anarchism and all that. But on that debate, there's sometimes very simplistic sort of reasoning, and it also shows that, because we normally think, we are so used to thinking about representation and therefore the political as something that deals with the state, and in those anarchist inspired social movements, sometimes it's been, if we take representation more seriously, then it means that suddenly we become like a political party within the state, and we go back to sort of politics as usual, the old boring corrupt politics. And there are many fascinating dilemmas in both in social movement politics and also in corporate power when you start looking at them through the lens of political representation.
Absolutely. And now let's go back to the initial question. What about the UN system? What about the UN Charter? What about international humanitarian law or international law? It seems today that the big corporations, the big, also artificial intelligence, the big Elon Musks and Zuckerbergs of this world, they seem to don't have any boundaries. Law, it seems, don't apply to them, it seems. Trump stated that Greenland is in his national interest. he invaded without the UN Charter, without, with ignoring the UN Charter in Venezuela, Iran, and so on and so forth. Russia invaded Ukraine, and the list goes on and on and on, and it's a, how can I say, ugly side of history. So, yeah, what about representation on the international level? Who cares? And is the UN Charter obsolete?
Well, I think to some extent there's exaggeration on the breakdown of the legal framework and on what some would call rules-based order. On the one hand, there have been violations of that order many times before. Now we look at, Trump making an attack on Venezuela that violates UN Charter. Well, the US has made so many violations of international law, and so have Russia, China also, too, especially historically. More if we think of, for example, China's westward expansion and all that. So sometimes I feel there's like idealization of the past in some of the stories we hear in the media about the breakdown of the rules-based order or the breakdown of the liberal international order, as if there sometimes was something we could honestly call liberal international order. So that's one thing. And also today, I mean, out of zillions of mechanisms of international law, most are functioning quite normally. So we see these violations of sovereignty, we see these violations of international humanitarian law, we see different violations, and it's true, I don't want to downplay the importance of these violations, but yet, for example, the United Nations, we may think, all right, it's lost all relevance, and still you see countries that violate international law devoting quite a lot of energy to trying to convince others to vote somehow in their favor or against their enemy in the UN. And I sometimes, like with Russia, like, all right, if it's really true that Putin doesn't give a shit about, the UN, why is he devoting so much time to trying to get all those African countries to vote for him or not vote against him in the UN? Then the same can be seen perhaps about the United States and many others, including Israel. The fact that there are violators of law does not mean that the law has become irrelevant. And of course, it could get more serious for the current order. Let's imagine the United States deciding to leave the United Nations. That could have, on the one hand, if nobody follows the US, then whether that's good or bad for the UN can be debated and all that. But then, of course, if it opens a chain reaction, especially if Morten, Argentina of Milei, or El Salvador of Bukele, who might be some of the likely candidates to follow suit, Israel maybe also. Yes, we have the scenario of a more serious breakdown of international legal order, but I don't think we are there yet. I think it's been exaggerated a little bit until now. But yeah, the future is open.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I see your point, especially the term that was, invented, so to speak, by the Russian Federation was the so-called special military operation. So if they don't care, they say, okay, we invade Ukraine and we don't give a, F. So, but they care. So it seems they invented because they don't, practice war. Of course, they are the good guys. So they invented this term special military operation. Also, Trump stated that what was it? Not confiscation, but a legal. What was it? So he also legitimized the intervention in Venezuela, which was against international law, of course. But he tried to frame it like, yeah, but this is he's going to trial, so we pick him up. So yeah, I get your point, but
Yes,
isn't
indeed.
it like it seems to me that more and more the masks are getting off, and the more they show, leaders show their true interests. For example, Trump stated that it's about oil and it's about national interest. So more and more we see the true interests behind humanitarian intervention, between protecting women and human rights and schools, and so maybe this is the shift that we are currently witnessing.
Yeah, there's something like that going on, and in some sense, what you say may lead to the possibility to think that in some sense Donald Trump is more, let's say, in his outspoken way of doing and talking about things and justifying them, might be seen as more honest than some other US presidents. Of course, not in everything, and he lies quite frequently, as we all know, including in those things. Well, the justification that you were referring to for the Venezuela thing was there was a lot of talk about drugs and international terrorism related to drugs, and that's legally important for the United States to at least attempt to make the claim that it's actually Venezuela that has been attacking the United States by sending drugs to the United States, and the United States has just been defending itself, and then the police operation kind of legal case that they are trying to make about Maduro, and of course that shouldn't hold in a serious court. But let's see what happens. Also about oil, I think actually it's and I have the temptation, and in some sense it sounds even refreshing that he's saying like, okay, we are in Venezuela for the oil. We are not there to save democracy, as many others would have said, and save human rights and protect women and whatnot, but for the oil. So this cynical nature might actually be more transparent and honest than some other discourse of US president. Then again, I happen to think he didn't go in only for the oil, and he exaggerated the importance of oil. He was talking about the oil also to tell his constituency back home, the MAGA people in particular, look, there's so much oil here, so this intervention doesn't cost us anything because we'll just grab the oil. So American taxpayers don't have to pay anything, which was a way for him to sort of avoid openly violating his electoral promises of not getting stuck in interventions in faraway places as his predecessors had done. So yes, maybe we are going towards more. Of course, there's more like in traditional international relations theories, we have this sort of realism versus idealism, sometimes called liberalism, and blah blah blah. For example, in Finland was involved in the war in Afghanistan for a long time, and as part of the sort of US led, at some point more multilaterally led, at other points more US led thing. And the justification was always, we are there to save Afghani women and that kind of thing. And if somebody said, hey, you are engaged in a war, it's not like, blue berets going to be neutral people between, let's say, Israeli forces and Hezbollah or something like that. No, you're participating in a war on one side of somebody who's waging a war against the other side. And it was so difficult for the Finnish leadership to ever acknowledge this. I remember I went to, as part of the Finnish Institute for International Affairs, I'm in the advisory council of it. We went a few years ago to Estonia, and then the Estonian foreign policy leaders were like, no, oh, women, no, we don't know, maybe, but we are there to show the United States that we are committed, and we hope that when Russia attacks Estonia, United States will remember how many Estonian soldiers died in Afghanistan fighting for the United States. End of the story. So today, just to conclude, today, Finnish foreign policy discourse is much closer to that of the Estonian discourse before, much more realist in this sense. And now if somebody would say we were there mainly only to save Afghani women, that would sound like ridiculous, because of course it paid off in the sense that it gave Finland some political capital to show the United States that they were committed to doing things together with the United States, and Finland became a NATO member, and that certainly played a little part in that. And now everybody's saying more openly the real reasons for having been there. So we are moving to that kind of world where myself not coming from realist IR analysis background or anything like that, but there are some things are being said more openly and therefore more honestly and transparently. Whether honesty and transparency are always good things is of course another thing. Maybe slight hypocritical pretending to be on the side of sort of saving the women and good things may have also good impacts. But yeah, there's a little bit more honesty here with all the lies that we read about all the time.
It seems a little bit ridiculous and even funny. If it wasn't involved, war and conflict, it would be a perfect, comedy. But how do you, analyze? What's your opinion on, Finland accessed NATO and because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So now we have, it seems like a transatlantic divorce 2.0. The first one was in 2003 when the US invaded Iraq, and Germany, especially France, were against this invasion. And so many scholars stated that this was the first transatlantic divorce. And now it seems like transatlantic divorce 2.0 with this, Greenland and illegal invasion in Venezuela. Now he's also threatening Canada. He stated that this is the 52nd state or what, and he makes joke. And even a Republican congressman said that what state? Denmark? No, New Zealand? Well, I don't know. So they make jokes out of it. So having said all that, do you see that Finland is now reorienting, or should we imagine NATO in somewhat, isolated from the US? Maybe is this the start of a European army, a European branch of NATO? And how is Finland reacting to, okay, now we accessed NATO, but NATO is, the US is the leading force in NATO. And now suddenly Trump is turning things around, is also trying to isolate himself from Europe. And you guys, you need to care of your security by yourself. So how is Finland now reacting to this, geopolitical shift?
Yeah, well, it's kind of... it could be seen as hilarious, like finally joining NATO and then suddenly and buying, committing Finland's defense dependence from the United States by buying a lot of new aircraft from the US just before their this rift, or however we want to call it, becomes apparent. I think this time it might be more serious because, of course, there were disagreements about kind of means to what ends are used in Iraq and what kinds of violations are involved in that, or in Venezuela or something. But now it's the threat, and it is a threat. I've difficulties thinking there would be a true military occupation by the US in sort of with territorial conquest of Iceland, but in any of Greenland. But in any case, the threat itself is probably perceived as more serious crisis than the 2003 situation meant to, because now the threat is about European European countries, even though it gets complicated with colonial possession far away from European lands, as Greenland is. So in this context, Finland, I think, as we have seen, President of Finland has become a player bigger than the size of Finland, because when big European countries are meeting with Donald Trump in recent months, normally there's also somebody from a small European country, the only one from a small European country, Finland's president there, who has the good luck of getting along quite well with different kinds of people. He's very pleasant, and having a good knowledge of the United States, knowing some key people in the United States, and being a good golf player. So in last March, he went to play golf with Donald Trump, and he seemed to have a kind of special relationship with Donald Trump. And this has become a little bit embarrassing now. There are in Finland, this picture of our president with Donald Trump playing golf together. And the same day when Donald Trump was giving announcements from the same golf field about the need to acquire Greenland, and Finland making deals with Donald Trump to have icebreaker ships that the US lacks and Finland is good in producing. So there's a slight uncomfortable element there. But then, which seems a little bit more uncomfortable today, I think what Finland is trying, the Finnish foreign policy leaders are trying to sometimes emphasize, like, look, we have a special situation, different from, let's say, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Western Europe, long border with Russia, and therefore, for example, now in the very recent days, when even the Swedish foreign policy establishment has been making clearly more critical comments about the US foreign policy in relation to Greenland in particular than before, Finnish response has been much more muted. And I think their justification in this, like in other similar situations, is that Finland has a long history in being left alone with their big neighbor in the east, with Russia, and being in a more delicate situation. Therefore, others should show more understanding towards Finnish restraints about going out very critically against the United States. But the situation has changed. Here in Finland, the media has in the past week or so been saying over and over again, why can't you, let's say, foreign minister or president of the republic, why can't you condemn what Donald Trump is doing? And they go like, oh, yeah, well, we are against violations of international law, and, and we regret the situation. And I think actually not being somebody seen as very close to the current government, or any governments for that matter, they have changed their comments. The Finnish Minister of Defense, Foreign Affairs, President of the Republic, their comments about the US have been significantly even if for many not sufficiently more critical of the United States, even if they don't say, Donald Trump, I condemn you, because they believe that everybody understands that saying so would be counterproductive to Finnish security situation. So Finland is another thing, perhaps with more general relevance, but here is about international law, is this attitude that since Russia, especially Russia, is violating international law, why should we follow to the letter everything that international law says? And this was a big debate about the new border security law a couple of years ago and renewed last year, where it was clear to everyone, including those who defended the new law, that that law violates Finland's obligations vis-a-vis some international treaties related to refugee rights and asylum seeking and all that. And yet the great majority of the parliament decided to pass that law, even if it's arguably it's also against the Finnish constitution. Most constitutional lawyers would say it's against the constitution, but at least it's clear it's against international obligations of Finland. So the argument there is, if Russia doesn't follow international law, why should we follow international law, like keeping our border open so that there can be something called hybrid warfare kind of things, of sending zillions of refugees through the borders to Finland and things like that. So the fact that big powers are more reckless about international law does have effects on countries like Finland and many other countries. Like, all right, if the big ones don't follow it, why should we? Especially if we are bordering a big one that doesn't follow it.
Absolutely. And you said one thing, that the European countries, also the European Commission, von der Leyen and many others, Kaja Kallas, they hesitate to condemn. Even Friedrich Merz, German chancellor, stated that, yeah, the attack on Venezuela is complicated and he couldn't find the right words. Also in regard of the Iran strike and the, he said that Israel is doing the dirty work for us. So in that sense, but in regard to the US, the question why Europe hesitates to condemn the US if the US is violating international law, in my opinion, maybe it has to do something with they are afraid of certain acts because the US is so powerful. Not only that, for example, the nuclear umbrella, only France and the Great Britain have nuclear weapons, so we are under the umbrella of the nuclear, of the US. Maybe this is one reason. The second reason is, as Denmark suffered from a hybrid attack, the US can, with this term kill switch, they can switch off basic, like Microsoft, like basic technologies, and we are, so to speak, back in the days, back in 100 years. So maybe there are technological hybrid war tactics, and so yeah, it's obvious why we are a little bit more quiet in regard of the US. I wonder if you agree.
Yeah, the kill switch thing is something prevalent in debates in Finland as well, especially now that Finnish Air Force in particular will depend much more on the US. Of course, the manufacturers of their machines denied that there's possibility for some kind of kill switch. So but more generally, the technological, sort of frameworks, the standards, everything. Some see, like, there's a kind of US-centered, but there are many metaphors, the ecology of technology or something like that, and then a China-centered one, and somehow one should choose where to place oneself, and if Europe is not able to develop its own sort of technological systems and frameworks and standards that are competitive enough. So this is a big debate, and it does affect and lead to the reluctance of European state leaders to be more outspokenly condemning the US. And probably also though I think most might be changing about that, because in some sense I sometimes wonder whether these attitudes towards Donald Trump are like that the European NATO leaders who talk about the daddy and all that, whether that means treating Donald Trump as somehow hierarchically high up, or whether that actually is kind of infantilization of Donald Trump, and sort of hoping that there's a tacit agreement in, let's say, in this case in Europe, between these foreign policy leaders and the citizens or the voters, that everybody knows, as probably is the case, that many of these leaders despise many things that Donald Trump does. They think he's stupid, bad-mannered guy. That's what many of them think, I'm pretty sure. But then by not saying that, and hoping that the general public will understand that this is a game we have to play, and perhaps even hoping that it's kind of the superiority of the Europeans in that sense, that they are, because they are sort of beyond the childlike. Now I'm using this childlike, this I used so much now. Right today, we saw the letter of Donald Trump to Norwegian Prime Minister saying, like, I so much want to do peace, but since you didn't give me the Nobel Peace Prize, now I will no longer only do peace. Now I will start, keeping to the US interests and all that. So it's, of course, today has been filled, international media has been filled with terms like childish and childlike. So in this sense, perhaps for the foreign policy leaders who act in a certain way towards Donald Trump, they hope that people know that it's a carnival kind of situation where the Mad King is there, and you just, you just pretend you are treating him as a great leader, whereas you hope your voters understand yet that you're treating him as a childlike creature. I'm actually interested in this because I've been studying a little bit infantilization as a sort of strategy of colonial attitudes, and normally it's towards the poor, the underdeveloped countries, or the colonies, or the people classified as crazy, or sex workers, or drug users, or people, sort of entities that are deemed less adult-like as normal liberal adults, and it's not so often that we have a situation where one of the greatest leaders, in the sense of person who commands most guns in the world, the biggest guns in the world, is treated in so infantilizing ways as we see today happening around Donald Trump. It's fascinating for cultural studies of world politics, fascinating phenomenon.
It is fascinating, and at the same time it is so scary. This guy is sitting on 5,000 nuclear bombs and has 80 over what not 80 800 bases all around the world in every continent. So it's I'm not sure if I want to laugh or cry, but maybe both. Yeah, this is absolutely hilarious. Absolutely.
But of course, it's possible to give a slightly more optimistic note that he is, and to some extent, he might be eager to take home some of those bases. And now the big thing about Europe is whether to say, hey, please, Donald, take your people, take your army bases back to the US. We'll try to manage here. The problem is Europeans I'm not sure whether they will be able to manage vis-a-vis Russia in particular in this situation. But my point also is we have to remember there are people sometimes with reasonably good justification in, let's say, left-leaning peace movements, for example, who have thought that Donald Trump is much better US president than the others, because to some extent he has been reluctant to involve, especially boots on the ground kind of things for the US in faraway countries, especially in the Middle East. There was this in and out attack in Iran, and there are many other attacks, but there's some promise of that in Donald Trump, which is why if you listen to certain parts of the peace movement, leftist peace movements, you can see surprisingly positive comments about him.
Yeah, it in some way it makes even sense, because he tries to portray him as the deal maker, this New York business guy and broker and real estate, agent and mogul, who is always trying to find a solution, win-win, not always win-win, but transactional. He's thinking in transactional terms. So in this kind of sense, yeah, it makes it is clear that it could be it has some positive aspects. Also in regard of the Middle East, he tried to broker a peace deal between, I believe, South and North Korea. I believe even between Cambodia and what was it? Thailand. Yes. So yeah, he did some efforts in regard. Also, he tried to in the Alaska. He tried to broker a peace deal between Zelensky and Putin. So yeah, one can argue, but this is unfair because he didn't listen to the Ukraine people, and without the Europeans. So yeah, it's ambiguous, but politics is ambiguous and contradictive in nature, I believe. So it is always complex. If you ask, for example, also in regard to Venezuela, I was invited in a Austrian radio show, and two people from Venezuela say that we are happy that Maduro is gone, and we are absolutely happy, and most of the people, they are chanting and dancing. So I can understand Venezuelan people that suffered from this authoritarian regime. On the other hand, we have to admit that this was a violation of international law, and if this rule applies for everyone, so then Austria can invite South Tyrol, and let's bring it back. So if that's the case, then what's the point of international law? So yeah, it is ambiguous, and contradiction are everywhere, it seems. This makes politics so fascinating, like a like a good Hollywood movie.
Certainly, and there are, like, as you rightly said about Venezuela, many people are happy that, of course, the regime is not down yet, but at least there's a window of opportunity. People who don't like the current regime now, perhaps as academics, one task is beyond saying what's good or bad or something, is trying to at least try to keep that truth is not violated so much. For example, one may think, and there are many people who think, that it was good that the US invaded or did the operation to take Maduro out, and then one could debate that. But then the fact that it violated international law should not be negated, and this tendency, as I said, in Finland, for example, there was this big debate, and almost everyone in the parliament voted for a new law, border law, that was violating Finland's international obligations. And my way of also analyzing this was, to see who were the people who were denying the very, very obvious fact that international norm was being violated. And it's much more honest to say, yes, this implies violation of international law or some other law, But still, we believe that in other considerations override the concern for international law in this case. That's a more coherent kind of argument, that that's better for sort of rational debates and arguments about these things. Unfortunately, obvious facts are often being sort of black is being told it's white in many cases. So if you are for or against someone, then you try to twist the facts as much as possible.
Absolutely.
That's at least something where scholars should play a role.
Absolutely. I have a question in regard of two articles of yours, and you said it in the interview as well. In regard to the World Social Forum, you published an article also with Heikki Patumäki in 2004 and one alone in 2007. What's your opinion on the World Social Forum? Is it a kind of a progressive force for a transformation? Is it stuck in between? And also, what is the current, point of view there in regard of BRICS, for example? Because there are emerging powers, especially China as the maybe new hegemon. One can argue the biggest economy, soon the most, nuclear energy facilities, maybe the green, the green capitalist of our days, with solar energy, wind, and many more, and powerhouse. So, what is the relation between World Social Forum and BRICS on the one hand, and do you see the World Social Forum still as a force for progressive social movements? And what's your take on that?
Good questions. The World Social Forum emerged before BRICS, or even BRIC emerged. Of course, one thing that connects them is the B in BRICS, Brazil, where the World Social Forum also started. So from the very beginning, in the kinds of social movements and non-governmental organizations and other actors that gathered in the World Social Forums, there were different kinds of disagreements and dilemmas. One was, is this merely a space where different actors gather and then articulate and do things and learn from each other and create new networks? And for example, the biggest demonstrations in the history of the humankind related to what you referred to as the previous bad moment within Transatlantic Alliance 2003, the biggest street demonstrations 15th of February 2003, where to a significant extent sort of emerged from the World Social Forum against the war in Iraq. At the same time, the World Social Forum as such never took a stand against the war in Iraq, because is it an open space or is it movement of movements? So that's been a big debate. It's sometimes there's some correlation between the people, sometimes more anarchist minded, sometimes more traditional NGO minded, influenced by Gandhi in India and others, that it should be more a space from within where social actors emerge and articulate. Those who were seeing it perhaps more as a political actor in itself have sometimes been more keen to support or articulate with certain kinds of states that were emerging when the World Social Forum emerged in 2001. Then a couple of years later, Brazil has a progressive government with Lula very involved in the World Social Forum. There was Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Those were in Latin America the two key examples. In India, there was a much more progressive government than today, when 2004 World Social Forum was organized there. So and in each case, there's always been a debate about to what extent the social forms should give room for these big leaders, to state leaders from the global south to talk and speak there, and to what extent the movement should support in world politics these movements. And it's there are, for example, the World Social Forum isn't what it was. There will be a new edition next August in Benin, in Africa, and there was one in Nepal, there was one in Mexico, and so on and so forth. It's still there, but not as big and not as influential as it used to be. But the dilemma, what to do with BRICS kind of countries. I was recently in South Africa, for example, and it was clear in South African social movements, you have some tendencies who think, okay, BRICS is progressive, and you know, South African government certainly thinks so, participating in BRICS and all that. And then there are social movements who think like BRICS are actually not very anti-systemic. They are just, you know, doing some mild reforms, whereas not being radical enough vis-a-vis certain demands, whether related to Israel-Palestine, whether related to feminist demands, whether demand related to role of big corporations and anti-capitalist struggles and all that. So in whenever there's a BRICS meeting, there are also these alternative BRICS meetings, some which might be more like, okay, social movement alliances coming together to see how they can support BRICS kind of things, and others being more skeptical. Let's follow what these big leaders of our countries that claim to be transformative and revolutionary and whatnot in the world. But as you see, you know, you have Modi in India, you have different, for some time you had Bolsonaro in Brazil. So of course with Modi and Bolsonaro, now there's Lula, but there could be somebody else. There's an election in Brazil in between October and December, October and November, with 2 rounds probably. Yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't generalize. The movements, social movements are divided on these issues. And of course, Russia was always, to some extent, from the very beginning, a little bit, to my taste, artificial, odd person in this group, in this name denomination invented by, was it the Goldman Sachs person, Jim O'Neill, I think, that invented the acronym, and there wasn't anything like that. It's a funny emergence, like investment banker invent something. These are emerging somehow, and somehow Russia and Brazil and India and China seem like part of the same gang. And the big difference is that Russia never was part of what we tend to call the global South. And it's I think it's always, for many other members of BRICS, it's been a little bit uncomfortable to have Russia there, but somehow it was from the beginning, and you don't throw it out after that. So Russia also obviously divides things. And in BRICS also, it's as we know, the tension between China and India, for example, is something that means that BRICS in itself cannot be a very unified actor in world politics. But I guess in the moments, you know, there are many are ambiguous. I sometimes think BRICS may play a little bit similar role than let's say the Soviet Union did in domestic politics of many countries. Even for people who may think, as I do and did, that Soviet Union was a tyrannical form of, you know, government and entity, an authoritarian system. Still, one can argue that its existence and the fear of communist revolution spreading in Western Europe, for example, was one factor that made Western European governments give concessions to the workers' movements, more rights, more welfare state, and something like that, so that they wouldn't become communist. Now we have a little bit similar, because there's BRICS. Then it means that, for example, in the United Nations that we were talking about, a few minutes ago, there are many people, including right-wing president of Finland, saying like global south is underrepresented in international institutions and the UN. He's actually speaking like, you know, if I was speaking like that, and maybe I was 10 years ago, everybody here in Finland would say, you communist agitator, you know, shut up, never gonna happen. Now we have a right-wing president saying these things because they realized one reason. They realized like, unless some concessions to this real question of underrepresentation of global south, not only in the UN, not only in the Security Council, also in the World Bank, in the International Monetary Fund. Unless something is done, China will be more able to attract them. And therefore, they have an opening. They have a possibility to improve their possibilities, their voting rights within the international system in a similar way that working a little bit, there's analogy is always bad, but there's some analogy between these and the way workers' movements were able to gain more rights because the bourgeoisie feared the Soviet threat. And here one can say China is authoritarian country, and BRICS can also be seen as China and its friends. And I actually believe the more BRICS has expanded, it's become like China and its friends kind of coalition here. I'm simplifying this a little bit. So BRICS does play a role. It would be stupid not to attribute some causal powers to BRICS in the world system today. Within the movements, what divides opinion is whether that's to what extent that's a progressive causal impact.
I totally agree. And I was attending the second international conference on critical peace studies, which was in Pakistan, also quite funny. And there, Professor Huma Bakai provided a very compelling analysis on contemporary geopolitical shifts and alignments and you know alliances. And she said clearly that she's against multipolarity because this means a fight for hegemony. And she criticized this framing, and she was arguing this is a dangerous, you know, rivalry and block confrontation that we are analyzing. So she tries to avoid it. And she said that instead she advocates more for multiplexity, as she called it. And she defined this as a global system characterized by multidimensionality, complex interaction, absence of hegemony. So decentralization, and so on and so forth. So if it's realistic, this is another point. But from a emancipatory perspective and theory, yeah, this is a good lens. So I wonder if you agree on that, on the terminology, multipolarity versus multi-complexity. So, but what is the absence of hegemony? I'm not sure if, but yeah, that's up for debate.
Yeah, well, those complex multiplexity, hyper multiplexity. I don't know on the basis of the term itself. It's hard to know about hegemony. My sort of background tells me that U.S. hegemony is gone since long time ago. The eagle crash landed a long time ago. So, but this is also in international relations and studies of politics more generally. This hegemony, are we still in some sort of hegemonic moment, hegemony of the United States? It seems that people doing security studies tended to think like, okay, there was a bipolar world until breakdown of the Soviet Union, and then after that the United States became the sole superpower, and you know now something might be happening, now it might be crumbling or something. Okay, and it makes sense. The US still has a lot of arms, many guns, right? More than anybody, more possibilities to operate globally in military sense than any other state in the world. But then there's this other story, like more political economy kind of story, that after the Second World War, the US was hegemonic, US alone. and then its hegemony started waning, perhaps for some even in the 1970s, and the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system and all that, or for some in the 80s, and it's been kind of going down for a long time, and of course in this story, like what's happening with Donald Trump, for example, is to some extent can be seen as a consequence of a long-term hegemonic decline of the United States, rather than something that starts a downturn of a glorious hegemonic position of the US until Trump. So it depends a little bit whether you look at the guns, you look at other things, and also in hegemony, whether you look at because you need to look at the guns, of course, but also the power of persuasion, and whether you are a Gramscian or whether you are a realist IR scholar or Machiavellian or whatever, power has these two dimensions, like possibility to coerce and the possibility to get consent from others. And now with Donald Trump, it's become perhaps more obvious that the possibility to get consent from others is much less there than it used to be, and than it would be for anybody claiming to be a hegemonic power, even if you have many guns. But then again, others may say guns are the main indicator, and then the US seems still pretty powerful.
I can't resist to ask the last question. You hosted us from the critical political economy, and there were a huge conference, I believe 2 or 3 days, and it was wonderful at the University of Helsinki. I enjoyed it. A lot of great papers were presented, and great scholars, great human beings. And as part of this conference, Critical Political Economy, I remember you showed us several historical places around, in Helsinki. And there was a square, I remember, and you showed us, I don't know, was it a hotel? I'm not sure. And a symbol was embedded on the ground, and it was a swastika. And me, coming from Austria, I was a little bit scared. And and you said, we Finland, and what was it? You said that the army, the Air Force, wanted to have a badge, a symbol of the swastika, and they argued that this is pre World War II, and this has nothing to do with it, and this. Could you elaborate on the symbol, on the history of Finland, and about this embedded symbol that was there?
Okay, I actually just published until now only finished the first really real book on history of the swastika in Finland. It's also more globally. I went to Mongolia, India, China, many places to study it. But here, Finnish Air Force actually still has the swastika as its official symbol, and there's been this debate. All the foreigners come and what, and then they say no. It was given by a Swedish count in 1918, and look, Hitler invented his swastika only in 1920, so it cannot have anything to do with that. And this has been the story over and over again, and so as many others, but I guess myself more than others, because it was nice to study something where I knew nobody has ever studied this thing before. So it's nice for a scholar looking at how it was used in the old times in Finland, and the claim of Finnish Air Force and Finnish state that it has nothing whatsoever to do with the Nazi swastika doesn't really hold water. Of course, it's different. Swastikas are so different in many parts. But first, So my argument was that from 1871 to swastika, when it was found in the ruins of Troy by Heinrich Schliemann, it became quite soon in the 19th century a symbol of anti-Semitic racial nationalists more generally, and anti-Semitics more specifically. And it became also a symbol of sort of nationalism, national romanticism, and something like that. So before the First World War and before Russian Revolution and before Hitler's establishment of the Nazi Party in Germany in 1920, it circulated. Of course, it had many other uses also, but as a sort of symbol in the anti-Semitic and other kind of hardcore right-wing movements, racist right-wing movements. So the Swedish count that gives it to in his airplane that he flew to Finland during the Civil War was part of these right-wing movements. But of course, he was not an official Nazi because nobody was. But he did become one of the key persons in National Socialist Bloc in Sweden. He was brother-in-law of Hermann Göring, and he was a very good personal friend of Adolf Hitler. Of course, Finnish Air Force would, but in 1918 he wasn't. So you can't, it's bad explanation to do like that. So in any case, I wrote this book. I don't want to go into details. I hope it will come out in English. Nice thing you talk about, and my colleagues were making fun of me. I mean, in a nice way, like about social impact. I published my book in August. It gets a lot of media attention in Finland. Actually, you Google my name and swastika internationally, it got a lot of international attention, even if it was written in Finnish. And then the biggest newspaper of Finland has a big 2-page story about my arguments about how I never said don't use it. I don't moralize. I don't, not my style. But I said it causes friction in Finland now in NATO times. Because here everybody says, why should we care about what Putin does? Putin tells everybody's Nazi. Why should we get rid of the swastika just to please Putin? And I was like, have you ever checked what, the Dutch, the Austrians, the Germans, the US, the West thinks of the swastika? And now Finland joins NATO. So it became a moment of recognition. And 3 days after, in the biggest media attention to my book about the swastika, the Finnish Air Force gives a formal announcement that after 108 years, 107 years of using the swastika from the very beginning, they have decided to get rid of it. And that was nice. I did hear that my book did play a certain role in that deliberation. My guess is they would have made that decision at some point in any ways, but since there was a lot of media debate in that moment a few months ago, then they decided to make that announcement. The Minister of Defense, I heard, was against the decision. He wanted to continue with the tradition, but perhaps officers closer to what this kind of thing, that now there are these coalitions of the willing emerging around Ukraine and more generally European defense, and that the swastika itself is counterproductive in these situations. For example, and you get me going, I talk 8 hours about the swastika, but just to give you one example, German Air Force came to practice 4 years ago 4.5 years ago in Finland. And at the end in Lapland, the Finnish Air Force told them, like, okay, that's the final ceremony we all do together. And then the Germans found out that they are going to put the swastika flag in the flagpole because that's the symbol of the Lapland Air Force regiment. And of course, they said, we are Germans. Of course not. We cannot come. And they didn't go. And that was one example of how the kind of obvious fact that using the swastika is very conducive to smooth cooperation with your European NATO partners. Supposedly the US wouldn't matter after Trump's re-election so much. Biden administration had given a lot of signals that why are you using the swastika? Trump administration has not been giving that kind of signs. But in any case, they got rid of that. So it's a fascinating story. You want to hear 12 hours of my ranting about the swastika? Call me.
Yeah, this is a fascinating topic. No, it was a wonderful experience in Helsinki, and yeah, it stays with me. So I will never forget that.
Oh, right.
It was very impressive. I wonder if, but maybe it's off topic. I am not sure. Marta Havrishko, I believe. I don't. I hope I don't butcher her name. She's an Ukrainian, now living in the United Kingdom, United States. I'm not sure. She was a visiting professor, assistant professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, or maybe she's still. And she I follow her on I believe Instagram or Twitter or something, and she always showed Ukrainian some forces with also these badges of the swastika and other symbols, far right symbols of the Azov battalion and many more. I wonder, is there a relation to this kind of Finland and Eastern culture historic symbol, or is it the outright Nazi symbol? Or do you have any opinion on that? Did you heard these stories in Ukraine or any in any other places, or is it just I don't know, yeah.
Well, it's yes, I've seen the Azov battalion swastikas, and actually on both sides, because the on Russian side, then the
Yeah,
Wagner
there are two.
guys,
Yeah,
the
this is
leader had like swastika
yeah, this
tattoos.
is
So both
hilarious. Yeah.
sides have, and it's been fascinating also to follow how then you Nazify the other, and will denazify and all that. It's the history, actually the oldest, just to don't tell Putin, but the oldest swastika in the world, or in archaeological findings, we often think it's India and the Indus region and all that. No, it's Ukraine. It's there. So just to highlight that the swastika as a symbol has existed in so many places, and it comes up in so many ways in traditional cultures, in all cultures. But obviously since, let's say, 1880s, 140, 50 years ago, its political use in Europe has been often connected with either very, very nationalist, and where's the boundary, very nationalist expressions. In Finland, it symbolized the nation to many, especially many right-wing or patriotic people, and it still does. And I'm not so familiar of all the connotations in all parts of Eastern Europe. As you said, in Latvia, it's they have these that they call fire cross as a very important traditional symbol, and it's difficult to disentangle, because obviously then the alt-right or hardcore or racist right-wing movements may start using the symbols that originally were not connected in that particular site, not even to the extent they were perhaps in Germany in the late 19th century, or something to racist ideologies. Yes, I don't know. It's the Ukraine swastikas and the Azov battalion also remind me of how the Soviet Union in the old times. Sometimes in my book, I actually studied what was called at the time swastika epidemic, 1959, 1960, 61 maybe, where in Germany suddenly, and then in France, and then all over, even in Finland, United States, swastikas started appearing in synagogues, in cemeteries, public buildings, and there was this debate. Is it like a Nazi, neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic wave coming up in West Germany and somewhere? Or is it the Soviet Union trying to make West Germany appear as a sort of Nazi-infested place? And I think some of the archives later have shown that Soviet Union did play a role there, that it was through some East German government operatives that some West German hardcore right-wing, was it Reichspartei? I forget the name of one of these ultra-right parties of the time, that they had collaborated with East German communist government and in order to do their swastika operations, the swastika epidemic. So you have to, you know, these false flag operations also happening everywhere. And Ukraine is, I'm not a Ukraine specialist, so that's why I'm a little bit reluctant to give any sound opinion on that. But this thing about, okay, Russians are the real Nazis, and look at the swastikas in the Wagner people's tattoos, and look at the Azov battalion, and it's there's probably some truth to some of the uses being linked to racist ideologies, but since I'm not an expert on that, on Ukraine,
I absolutely understand, yes. But in times of war and peace, it seems that the good guys are always anti-fascist, the bad guys are always Nazis, and we, of course, are always fighting the Nazis. And so this rhetoric, it seems like, yeah, everybody exploits it. So, and it's interesting that, but every military also recruits from, you know, these football hooligans, but also from the right-wing sector. So, yeah, it's a dirty game. So, yeah, I believe it's complicated, like politics, like it's ambiguous, contradictive, and yeah, like everything, yes.
Yeah, sometimes even the Nazis can be used in nice ways. I was last year in Nanjing in China, and there was this guy who was head of Siemens, 1937, 38. He saw their Japanese invaders were approaching. The Nanjing massacre, rape of Nanjing happened. So he made a safe house. And how to make a safe house against the invading Japanese. He puts huge Nazi swastikas on the top of his building so that the invading Japanese troops and airplanes and bombers would not attack his house. And some call him these days Buddha of Nanjing, and the Chinese government actually sort of has put him very high up as a hero of the city and defender. And he was member of the National Socialist Party in Germany and using the Nazi swastika to save Chinese from the invading Japanese troops.
Hilarious. Amazing, yes, absolutely amazing. So yeah, we are almost 1.5 hours in this interview, and yeah, I don't have any questions left. So do you feel that we left something aside? You published so much, so I'm not sure what to tackle. I hope we presented you know, something of that. Yeah, if we should add something.
Well, of course we could talk hours, get more beer, and, you know, sit here, but others would get bored. So
yeah, beer would be nice. Yes.
right now, by the way, something just to mention, if somebody has any ideas, please send me. I'm looking at the sort of proprietarian thought. So how within what some would call libertarian or liberal, sort of liberal or libertarian defense of the property rights, that I rather call proprietarian, how those contradict with liberal ideals of freedom. And right now, studying John Locke. I did something on John Stuart Mill. On liberty there was actually a new translation published recently in Finland. I've brought the preface. And so it's really fascinating to look at how the classical liberal authors were not as pro-capitalist as they are made to seem these days. And that's a fascinating topic. So
Absolutely, yes. Wow,
more about
nice. Do you have any time, frame for when the English version of the swastika book will be published, or is it so maybe this year, maybe next year? You don't.
this year.
Okay, okay. Yeah, but as soon as it's out, we should do it, the interview again, and I will read it. Yeah, fascinating. So, dear Professor Teivo, it was a great pleasure and a nice talk, and I enjoyed it. I learned a lot. And thank you once again for showing us Helsinki. And yeah, it was a privilege. Hope to see you again.
Great. Come back soon, and we'll do other world political city walks. This was a great pleasure. Good learning experience. Hi to all your listeners, and let's stay in touch.